What a time to be in the hobby. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Glacial Geek Deep Thoughts Thin Coast with me, Phil the Glacial Geek. Today, I'm coming to you from the Falair, my man cave here. Still have access to it, which is pretty nice. No new guest to to kick me out quite yet. But yeah, so that's where I am, which is pretty nice. I'm going to be today working on Eisenhorn here, and if I need to wait for something to dry, I might be working on a little bit of Ezekiel as well. I've been working on him for a bit now. So that's what I'm going to be modeling up today. Hopefully I'll remember to paint. I'm going to keep painting. I've got a new paint color here today, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to try some Incubi Darkness on his coat. I think that'd be cool. Make him pop out a bit differently from my my Golden Girl. So yes, so today I'm going to be talking to you about Spam. Not the mysterious meat that is actually pretty tasty. But we're going to be talking about Spam when it comes to lists. And it has a very negative connotation. People talk about spamming things, spamming different units, especially when 8th edition started. Everyone was looking for the spam unit to take. And because of it, we ended up getting a couple different rules changed because of everyone doing that. So we had, all of a sudden everyone was like, you need to spam Storm Ravens. And everyone went out and bought 5 Storm Ravens to run at tournaments. And then GW came out and said, ooh, boots on the ground, so they don't count for tabling. So if he kills your, like, one unit on the ground, suddenly you're tabled now, and there's nothing you can do, even if 90% of your army is still technically there. They don't count for not being tabled, and they can't hold objectives. So because of that, everyone keeps looking for it. You talk about, they talk about now doing Reaper spam or heavy weapons team spam, mortar spam, any kind of spam. For a while you had Conscripts spam, and because of that, the Conscripts got nerfed. And a lot of different things like that have come out where everyone's looking for the unit that is at the optimal price with the optimal loadout, that it's the go-to unit that you need to take, that you need nothing else. That's all you need on the table is just a billion of those, and you're good to go. That seems to be like the focus of a lot, especially when new codexes come out, new rules come out, new everything comes out. Everyone's looking to see about spamming it. So they want to, for a lot of these, people think that they're being competitive by looking at a bunch of spam lists, and they're like, well, if you just, this is pretty good, so if you take 1,000 of them, that makes it ultimate good. No, nothing better could go. I'm just going to take 1,000 of these. The problem is that those lists do very well against certain opponents. They don't do very well against others. The fact is that spam lists are very one-dimensional. Spam lists don't have the same kind of versatility that regular list building will usually give you, especially if you're going into a tournament situation where you have no idea who your opponent is, you have no idea what your opponent is going to bring. They're left there with you have a lot more questions as to what you're going to face. If you're facing your friend in the garage and you know exactly who he's going to bring, then yes, you can tailor a spam list very easily to do well for you. For instance, if you know that your opponent's going to bring a whole bunch of tanks, if you spam las cannons, if you spam melta-guns in all their different varieties, odds are you're going to do very well. But if you're then going to be playing with that same list and suddenly he brings orcs, they're not going to care about those las cannons. They're not going to care about those melta-guns. High strength, high damage doesn't bother an orc. So if you brought that same list that tabled your friend's knight list to a tournament, and suddenly you come up against someone who's running, like I said, someone who's running orcs, or someone who's running a whole bunch of infantry from Astra Militarum, suddenly now you're left with a really bad matchup, and you're going to be in some major trouble. And this happens with every single this holds true with every kind of spam list. The Storm Ravens, they probably do better than most spam lists, just because of their ability to handle hordes and to handle strong things, because they got multi-meltas and twin assault cannons and hurricane bolters and whatever else you want to put on them. But in general, when you look at these spam lists, they're designed to handle one thing, because any unit is really designed to handle one thing. You know, you have your units that are great at handling hordes. You have your units that are great at handling strong, heavy, strong units, and they don't usually overlap very well because of the nature of how weapons work in Warhammer. You know, a meltagun has very low number of shots, but it does very well when you're shooting against a model that has a whole bunch of wounds that you're trying to take off. You know, but the getting to roll 2d6 and take the highest when you're shooting against a 1 wound model doesn't help you. But you're paying for all of that when you're buying those weapons. You know, same thing with the Reapers, with the Dark Reapers. Yeah, they're really good, but you know, they've got a low output of firing, and if they run up against something like an Orc Horde, they're not going to do as well as they are against against Primaris Space Marines. You know, they're really good at killing Primaris Space Marines, but they're not very good at killing Orc Hordes. You know, that's why when you look at the top list that came out that went to like LVO or anywhere else like that, they didn't just spam Dark Reapers. You know what I mean? Because Dark Reapers are really good, but they need support to be able to handle a whole bunch of different opponents. So when you look at the top lists for a lot of the top competitors, they don't have spam. You know, they don't really run spam, because what that does is it puts you in a situation where you're hoping for your opponent to bring a certain kind of list. And once you're doing that, you're already at a disadvantage going into a tournament. And you don't want that. You want to be able to go into any kind of matchup, any kind of game, and say that you have a chance. You know, there are certain units that are going to be very strong. So if someone's running an Eldar army in a competitive scene, they're probably going to have Dark Reapers, because if you run up against Primaris or whatever else, they're going to be very good at helping you handle that kind of situation. But at the same time, they're not going to necessarily do very well if you run into an Orc army. So you're going to have support. You're going to have other things there that are going to help you handle those other lists that are going to come. That's why it's not super competitive to run these spammy lists. You know, everyone talks about, oh, these spam lists are gross. They're ruining the game. That's only because you happen to have a matchup that worked very well against you. You know what I mean? So if you are running those Primaris Space Marines and your opponent just brings 1,000 Dark Reapers, yeah, it's going to feel like that spam is really bad. But if that same opponent ran up against Orcs, they're probably not going to win, like I said. So that's the problem with spam, is that it's seemingly easy to make a list with spam, because you just find a good unit and just buy and build 1,000 of them. But at the same time, you're left with a situation where you're not going to be able to be as versatile as you need to be at a tournament. The tournament scene is, you have zero control over who you're playing, and even if you know the meta and you know what the most lists that are going to be there, you know what all your friends are bringing, you know what everyone else is bringing, suddenly that guy comes who's just like, I'm just going to run a Green Tide, and suddenly your list that was going to be able to dominate that tournament scene, and you run into him first round, you've got your loss and you're not winning that tournament now. You know, that's why you need to be able to build lists. And you look at the top lists that they come, they choose certain factions. Yes, certain factions are going to be stronger than others, I think. It's just a matter of the game and way it works. I don't think you're ever going to get an absolute parity between armies. But at the same time, you look at their lists and they play a whole bunch of different units, because they know that they need to be able to do a whole lot of different things if they want to win a tournament. And the top competitive players that go into these tournament scenes, the players who really want to build a list that's going to do them well, go into these situations wanting to win. And they go into these situations knowing that they're not going to know everyone who's going to be facing off against them, especially if you go to something like an LVO, which doesn't just bring, that brings people from all over the world, let alone all the country, and you're going to have a whole bunch of people coming from a bunch of different places with a bunch of different metas, because the meta changes based upon what armies people are running. So if you go to a place that doesn't really do orcs, that doesn't really do infantry heavy guard lists, then suddenly you're probably going to have them coming out of a meta that really values high strength, high damage weapons like las cannons and melty meltas. But if you run into someone who's coming from a place that has a ton of orc players, that has a ton of infantry heavy guard lists, you're going to see them bring in a whole bunch of high output DACA lists, that are going to be able to handle that high number of models coming against them. And the reality of the situation is that you, if you're going to be trying to be a competitive player, and you want to go to a tournament that's not just your friendly local tournament, you're probably going to run into things that you haven't faced before, that you haven't seen before. And as such, you need to be prepared for the fact that your list that may do really well locally is not going to do as well. And the biggest way to avoid that is to avoid spam lists. Because, like I said, spam lists are really good against things that those units that you're spamming are really good against. But they're not very good against everything, and that's the problem. And there's ways in armies to make your army good against everything if you build your list and work your strategies properly. So for instance, with my Dark Angel stuff, Hellblasters are great. They're really great. But if I run into an Orc Horde, if I run into the Green Tide, those Hellblasters just don't have the right, the cost per shot that they can get isn't optimized for taking out armor 6, 1 wound, toughness 4 models. They're designed for higher toughness, higher wound count, higher armor models. And there's a lot of them out there that they do really well against. But if I run into something like a horde of orcs, the problem is not only is my weapon not optimized against them, but they can bring so many bodies now that I'm not optimized against that I'm left with a situation where I'm going to be at a disadvantage if all I have is those Hellblasters. So my list, has a lot of Hellblasters. I like to get that list because they do well against a lot of different armies. But at the same time, I also have my Dark Talon, which has a lot of strong output with the 2 Hurricane Bolters. I've got the the Talon Master, who has a twin heavy bolter and a twin assault cannon. That's all of a sudden now I'm looking at throwing in a whole bunch. I've got the bolter scouts. I'm looking at supporting those high strength shots, those high damage outputting shots that I can get with the Hellblasters, with Weapons of the Dark Age and whatnot, and I'm making up for it by taking other units that are really good at putting out a whole lot of low strength but high amount of DACA, and they help support my dark talons. They help support my Hellblasters, so that if I run into an Orc Horde, the Hellblasters are going to be able to kill some stuff, but those other things are going to be able to kill more of them, and that's going to be important. So I might not win as easily against an Orc Horde, but I have the weapons in there so that I'm not instantly losing. Whereas if I just spammed Hellblasters, I probably would lose that pretty hard and really fast, but you have to make a list if you want to be competitive that can handle, like I said, anything. So the all-comers list, people talk about it being difficult and that, now we're in the age of spam. No, look at the top lists. Seriously, look at the top lists in the tournaments, and you'll notice that they're not spam lists. Yeah, you had the Storm Raven spam list that was doing very well at ATC last year, but then the rule got changed, and suddenly now they're not as viable. And each of the situations where spamming became the obvious go-to answer, and it was going to be changing to the dynamics, you were left with a situation where the rules got changed around it. And now that GW is in a far more proactive mood, and they're actually doing things to counter a lot of these situations, you're going to find yourself having to deal with you're going to have to find yourself dealing with more situations where your all-comers list is going to be able to handle the game much better than your spam list. Because if you find the spam list, if it comes out, honestly, people are going to find it, they're going to try to abuse it, and it's going to get changed. For instance, look at Tau. They just started to announce now that commander spam is pretty much dead. So that's what Tower we're just taking a whole bunch of commanders. If you saw, like, I faced multiple commander lists multiple times in tournaments, and that's what Tau were doing. They were just bringing as many commanders as you could fit in a 2,000 point list and just going with it. And that was the go-to move for Tau players. But now GW comes out and says, ooh, yeah, you're only allowed one per detachment. You know? That's a quick way to get rid of that spam, you know? And again, it became an obvious choice. And because it was an obvious choice, they changed the rules. You know? So, and everything else that you see these strong models. And the problem was that commanders were able to handle everything. So they were able to handle high model count armies like orcs. They were able to handle strong things like Primaris Marines or tank heavy IG. And because of that, spamming them was the obvious answer. But now GW comes out and says, nope, we don't want that. And it's obvious that they don't want that, because that does make for a very boring game if all you have is the same thing over and over and over again, you know. And most of the time, if you spam it and you come up against the right opponent, you'll do well. But that's not going to make you competitive. It'll only make you competitive if you can control your opponents, to control who you're playing against. So if you're going into the same game week after week and you know that your opponent only has so many models in their army and you know what they're bringing, then yeah, you could go into it with a spam list and you'll do mighty well, because you know what they're bringing and you're going to be tailing your list by spamming what's going to be very bad for your opponent. But if you're going to any kind of situation where you have no idea what your opponent's going to bring, suddenly that spamming isn't going to be as effective and it's going to hurt you, because you're left with a situation that if you run up against your hard counters, and every spam list has a hard counter. Every spam list has a hard counter. And that's the problem, is that every spam list having a hard counter means that you're not going to do as well in the long run in a tournament scene, because odds are you're going to come up against that hard counter. You know, if you've only got 5 people in your tournament, maybe you can, you know, roll the dice for that. But if you're going to anything bigger, if you're going to a major tournament, if you're going to, honestly, with anything like in 10 or more people, suddenly now you're going to be left with a situation where your odds are you're going to be running into something that you're not going to be able to handle with your spam list, because your spam doesn't have the versatility. Plain and simple. So that's the reality of what spam is. So a lot of people complain about spam. They talk about how bad it is for the game, that it's the only way that you can win. And, you know, I don't agree. I think that there are certain units that are very good, and you'll see people take them a lot. You know, for instance, my Hellblasters. I take Hellblasters a lot when I go to tournaments. I take Hellblasters a lot because of what they can do for me. So if I know that I'm probably going to be facing off against someone who's going to have multi-wound models, anyone that's going to have some higher armor, then yeah, I want to have those Hellblasters there to do what they do, which is take care of all those multi-wound models, take care of all those high armor models. And they're very, very good at that. So I like to bring them because of that. But at the same time, I know that if I just bring them, I'm going to be left with a situation in a tournament where I'm going to be facing against an opponent who has a whole bunch of weak units that those Hellblasters are not optimized against. And they're going to be able to take out those Hellblasters, because those lot of weak units is exactly how you take down Marines. Way to fire. Just throw a whole bunch of DACA into their face, and they'll eventually start failing saves. You know, 3 ups, 2 ups, it doesn't make a difference. Eventually you're going to start failing those saves. And when you start failing those saves, models start dying. And at that point, my models are expensive, you know? And if they start dying, I'm left in a bad situation. So that's the thing. Those are kind of my thoughts on spam. I just don't think they're as it's not a super viable, and I never felt the urge to do it because of thinking about, when I look at lists and when I think about things competitively, I'm not thinking about the battle reports I do on my channel, because I change up my list a lot on my channel. I bring a lot of diversity on my list up on my channel, and same thing with my opponents. They bring a lot of different things, but those aren't for. I'm not looking to dominate on my in my games in there, which is a good thing because I don't. But I look at it when I look at the codexes when they come out, when I see the rumors that are coming out. my first thought goes to how's this going to affect the tournament scene? How's this going to affect how players are going to be bringing lists to competitive events that either I'm going to or I'm going to hear about. And when you start looking at it like that, spam doesn't become as enticing an option because of the fact that any spam list has some very hard counters. And if you have a list that has very hard counters, I mean, maybe it's just my luck, but I will always run into someone who has that. So for instance, my first tournament in 8th edition, I spammed las cannons. I brought 3 predators with las cannons. I had them sitting back with Azrael. They were, this gun line, they had a ton of las cannons. I had some las cannons on some Razorbacks. I had a freaking lot of las cannons. And in so doing, I ran into my first game, a mech list, a Space Marine mech list, and did very, very well. I tabled him basically. And it was brutal. It was a really brutal game, went really quick. And it did really well. So suddenly it's like, ooh, okay, maybe my spamming of las cannons was really beneficial. You know what I mean? And looking at the D6 wounds, that's what really enticed me at first about that. I was like, oh, that's great. I get to do D6 wounds, thinking about taking down tanks, thinking about taking down big monsters. And sure enough, my first game, I got to do that. I got to take on a whole bunch of like dreadnoughts, and it was super good, super effective. The next game, I ran into an orc horde, and he beat me pretty soundly and just ran all over my list, and he just swarmed me, killed me. I think I had like 2 units left at the end of the game. It wasn't pretty, and that's when I realized, oh yeah, I went with the easy spam output of las cannons with being protected by Azrael, but orcs don't care because orcs will die in the droves, and there's 1,000 more orcs behind them ready to keep coming. And that's very very fluff and narrative driven there, but that's also how they work on the table. You just have 1,000 bodies that are just impossible to reap your way through before they just overrun you. So that's kind of the reality of the situation, is that if you're going into a situation, into anything where you can't control who you're playing against, spam is not the answer. If you know exactly what your opponent's going to be bringing, if you know exactly what your opponent's going to be doing. For instance, if you know your opponent's bringing orcs and you spam a bunch of assault cannons and hurricane bolters and regular bolters, on cheap bodies, you're going to do very well, because you can just sit back, have him keep coming at you, just keep shooting and shooting and shooting, and suddenly your opponent runs out of bodies eventually, and you're going to win. But at the same time, if then the next game you go up against 3 Baneblades, all those bolter shots are going to be needing 6s to do anything, and it's going to be left with a situation where you're going to be hard pressed to win out the day. That's the problem with spam, is that it's just so easy to hard counter a spam list that you're eventually going to run into someone who has that hard counter if you're playing in any kind of situation where you don't know what your opponent is bringing. So, in my opinion, spam is nothing to be feared unless you happen to run into the hard counter to your list through spam. And it's not the way to go forward if you're looking to be competitive, because it's going to hurt you in the long run to have an army based solely on one option, because those options in the codexes are not designed to be all-comer options. A predator tank with all las cannons was never meant to be the option to handle hordes. It was never meant to be the option to handle light infantry. It was always meant to be the big game hunter. It was always meant to go out there and take down tanks, always meant to go out there and take down big nasties. And if you run into a list without them, they're highly reduced in their abilities to do anything. Same thing with the Dark Reapers. They're designed to go against high wound, high armor objectives and targets. And if you run a list that has just only 1 billion Dark Reapers, you're going to get overwhelmed and overrun by a horde list, just plain and simple. I think that Dark Reaper spam would have trouble against the Gene Stealer Cult. I think they'd have trouble against Orc Hordes. That's just the reality. And if you don't have the ability to make up for that deficiency with your list, then you're going to be hard pressed to do well in a tournament. That's just the plain simple reality of the situation. So don't look for the spam option every time it comes up. Don't look for the option that's the easy way to go out, because if you run into something that has a hard counter to what you're running, you're going to do really poorly. You might do very well, in 3 out of 5 games, but if you run into those 2 hard counters and they happen to come early, your tournament day is over real quick. Whereas if you're really looking to make a list that's going to do well for you in the long run, that's going to do well against anyone that comes your way, then make a well-balanced list. Look for the different options. Yeah, look for the really strong options that you have in those lists. If I was running Eldar, I'd have a bunch of Dark Reapers, just because they're really, really good at what they do. But at the same time, you need to fill out the rest of the army with things that help to support them, because otherwise you're going to be left like I said, you're going to be left with losses on your record, and that's not how you win tournaments. You win tournaments by going undefeated, and you don't go undefeated by having weaknesses in your list and in your army that are impossible to overcome. So that's just the reality of the situation, and that's why I don't think it's people scream bloody murder about spam lists, and I don't care about them. I don't look to them as an ideal thing to do. I don't look at them as like the end all be all of competitiveness, and I don't really look at them as viable options for me to really consider when I'm playing my game, and when I'm looking at making lists to take to tournaments where I think I'm going to be facing it, because they just don't hold the same kind of worrisome strength that I think a lot of other things do. So I'd be much more afraid of an Eldar list with a few Dark Reapers and a bunch of Shining Spears and a bunch of Guardians and a bunch of Rangers and a bunch of Farseers and all these different things, and these bring a whole bunch of different models that all do different things very well, and I'm going to be more afraid of facing that. So suddenly those Dark Reapers are taking out my Hellblasters before they can shoot, and the Guardians are taking out my Scouts and knocking them off objectives, and my and his Swooping Hawks are coming in and locking my shooty stuff in combat before they can do anything, and then jumping out of combat and letting everything else shoot on them once they're in range. It's a well-balanced list is way scarier to see across from you, because you can't just focus on one avenue and hope for the best at that point. You have to face off every single different thing that's coming your way. So that's why with my Dark Angels list, I've got the Hellblasters that are a very obvious target because they do very well. But if you focus on that Death Star of Hellblasters and Azrael and the Dark Shroud, then suddenly my Dark Talons coming up, is flying into your back line, dropping a stasis bomb, shooting off with the heavy rift cannon and the hurricane bolters, and taking down your units. Or my Reavers are dropping down and getting up in your grill. Or my Las Cannon Dev Squad is sitting off on the other side of the table, shooting at you and taking you down. Either which way, and if you face off against any of those other options, I've still got the Hellblasters to come up and do a thing. So I design lists and I fear lists that are more well balanced, that don't have the very obvious focus of attention. It makes target priority difficult. It makes tactics very difficult. And any time that you're making your opponent think, you're giving yourself an advantage. So if your opponent has to sit back and try to figure things out, they're going to have a harder time being able to execute during the game. Whereas if you come in and you drop down 3 Baneblades, I know exactly what needs to be done. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I know exactly what needs to be done. And at that point, I can then focus on making it happen versus trying to figure out what I need to do before I need to make it happen. So at the end of the day, spam it's an option you can take, and it might do very well against certain opponents, but you're going to run into eventually, if you run it consistently with a lot of different opponents against a lot of different armies, you're eventually going to run into some hard counters, and that's not how you do well in a competitive scene. You do well in a competitive scene by not having hard counters, by not having opponents that you just can't handle, by not having armies out there and lists out there that will just dominate yours. You do well in a competitive scene by being able to go into every single game with an understanding that you have a chance to win. So the top players, the ones who ended up at the top tables at LVO, wherever, they went with lists that were strong. And they went with lists that had strong units, that had strong tactics, that had strong support from strategies that they knew they wanted to use. But they were all lists that could handle anybody else that came their way. Because before they even made it to day 3, they had to beat 6 other opponents. And they didn't just luck out by not running into anybody that was their hard counter. They won out because they had lists that didn't have hard counters. You know, they're very good players, and they know what they're doing with those armies, and that's how they do very well. But at the same time, you don't do very well by wishing and hoping. Wishing and hoping only gets you so far, and eventually you're going to run into that hard counter, and you're going to have a short day. So that's my thoughts on spam. I don't think it's a viable option. I don't think that when you look at a new codex coming out that that's what you need to look for, and I don't think that that's the way forward for anybody looking to be more competitive with a list. Plain and simple. You know, you can get ideas by looking at what people are trying to spam and integrating them into your list. So if you're running Astra Militarum and you have a bunch of mortar teams, if you bring all mortar teams, you're probably going to run into a list that's going to be a hard counter to you, and it's going to eventually take you down. But if you have a bunch of mortar teams to help support your Lehman Russes, to help support your infantry units, you'll do well. You know, same thing with Eldar. If you run only Dark Reapers, you're going to have trouble. But if you throw in some Dark Reapers into your list, you'll probably do well. Dark Angels, only Hellblasters, you'll have a short time at a tournament. But if you bring a bunch of Hellblasters to help support and make it like a strong punch, you'll probably do well. You know, that's the reality of the situation, is that you need to be able to make a balanced list. And a balanced list doesn't mean you use every unit from the codex, but it does mean that you have different options for handling different types of opponents and different types of situations. And if you can do that, if you can make a list that can do that, you'll do much better than if you just try to spam everything, spam one unit from that codex to do well, and then block it out with a whole bunch of other chaff to make a list. So that's my thoughts on spam. Don't spam is what I kind of say. And not don't spam because it's unsportsmanlike. Don't spam because, you know, that's counter to what the game is supposed to be. No, don't spam because it's not good. Don't spam because you're going to lose. Don't spam because that's not how you get better at this game. You know, you get better at this game by thinking things through, thinking out the game, and thinking about what kind of opponents you're going to face, and having a list that can handle them all. You know, you might have opponents that you're going to do better against. Like, for instance, my Hellblaster list do better against, you know, units that have armor, armies that have a little bit of eliteness to them. You know, it doesn't do as well against Orc Hordes, but they can handle Orc Hordes because I have responses to the Orc Hordes. You know, and that's what you need to do, is you need to have lists that have responses to your opponent's armies that are going to be coming across the table. And that's how you do well in a competitive scene, you know? And if you can answer any kind of threat that your opponent's going to throw your way, and you start to get better at the game, you'll start to do better at competitive scenes. You know what I mean? I did pretty decently at LVO, went 4-2, but I need to probably fix some things in my list, and I need to get better at how I play. You know, the 2 losses that went up against, I learned a lot from. You know, I learned a lot about how to try to take on the Eldar. You know what I mean? And I'm, you know, still trying to figure out what I want to do and how I want to change things in order to do so. But I didn't feel like with my list that I went into any situation and was in danger of getting. I never went into it thinking I lost. Never went into any game at LVO that I thought I was lost right off the bat. I did lose a couple games, but I didn't think I was lost right off the bat. And that's how you make a competitive list. If you can go into any game and think, yeah, I can do this. If this works out this way and this works out that way, I feel like I have a chance, you know? And that's what you need to have for a competitive list. And then you get better as a competitive player by making those situations happen more often, you know, through tactics or deployment or whatever it is, and how you play, target priority, all the different things that go into becoming a better player. They happen as you grow better as a player. But if you're talking about list building, spamming isn't going to give you the tools that you need in order to do so, and in order to do so well. what you can do is make those all-comer lists and give yourself the tools in order to play better and in order to make better target priority and be able to counter different threats that your opponent's going to throw your way. So that's just my thoughts on spam. Leave it to the delicious mystery meat that it is, and keep it out of your lists for no other reason than it's not going to do you well in the long run. You know, I don't care about whether it's like the spirit of the game. I don't care about whether it's the way it was intended. I don't care if it's the easy way out. None of that bothers me. I don't care if someone brings a net list. I don't care. I don't care what you bring as my opponent. But as a friend of you here, I tell you not to bring it because it's not going to do you well in the long run. And it's not going to do you well to help with your competitiveness. It's not going to do you well in helping you win more games. Plain and simple. Unless you know exactly what your opponent's bringing, spamming is not the way to go. Spamming is not the way to win it. Plain and simple, you know, because it's super easy to to run into those hard counters if you have no control over who you're playing. Plain and simple. So, that's my thoughts. I'd like to hear what your guys' thoughts are. I know it's a very hot topic, and I know that it's been a hot topic back in through 7th edition, and now especially in 8th edition, because 7th edition started to tried to keep spam under control by having those formations that required you to take other units. But in 8th edition, that's not a thing anymore. I say a good thing that it doesn't have that anymore, but it does mean that you are going to be fighting and facing the possibility of bringing spam becomes more enticing because you're no longer forfeiting the benefits of formation anymore, but it's not going to do you well. You know, the enticement is there because you're like, well, if one's good, then 1,000's better, right? To a degree, you know, if one's good, 3 might be better, you know, but if you run into something that's a hard counter to those things, then having 1,000 of them is not going to be better. You know, having only 3 while having the support of 5 other things it's going to do you better. So, but yeah, let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you've feared and what you faced, and how you've handled kind of a spam list, because I know they're out there and I know a lot of people bring them, but you know, if you look at the results from tournaments, they don't do as well unless there's a situation that needed fixing, like with boots on the ground with flyer spam. So let me know what your experience has been, how you've countered it, how you've run into it, what you did to handle the situation, anything like that. Let me know down in the comments below. Keep the conversation going. I really do enjoy it. So I hope you guys have all enjoyed this. I certainly have. I have been Phil the Glacial Geek as always. And until next time, have fun.